Just 5 more minutes and I can lock up." Ryan Thompson wiped his grease-stained hands on the red shop rag hanging from his back pocket, the same pocket that had held his uncle's tools for 15 years before they became his. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed like angry wasps, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floor of Morrison Auto Repair. Well, it wasn't Morrison's anymore. It was Thompson's now, though Ryan had never gotten around to changing the faded sign out front. The last customer had picked up their Honda Civic 3 hours ago, but Ryan kept finding reasons to stay. Reorganizing tools that were already organized, checking oil levels in cars that wouldn't be picked up until Monday, sweeping corners that were already clean. Anything to avoid going upstairs to his apartment where the silence waited like a hungry animal. Ryan's hands told the story of his life better than words ever could. Thick calluses marked the spots where wrenches had rubbed for 12 years. Permanent grease stains darkened the creases of his palms, no matter how hard he scrubbed. A scar from his thumb to his wrist remembered the day he'd learned to respect power tools, courtesy of Uncle Pete's patient teaching. These hands had rebuilt engines, changed thousands of oil filters, and held his uncle's trembling fingers during those final weeks when cancer took away everything except Pete's stubborn determination to teach Ryan the business. But these hands had never learned to hold on to love. Ryan locked the cash register and flipped off the lights, leaving only the security lamp glowing near the door. His footsteps echoed as he walked toward the narrow staircase that led to his apartment. Each step creaked the same way they had when Uncle Pete lived here, when this place hummed with life instead of just the steady tick of the wall clock. The apartment was exactly what you'd expect from a 30-year-old bachelor who worked 70 hours a week. Mismatched furniture that had come with the place. A kitchen table covered in bills and automotive magazines. A refrigerator decorated with takeout menus and a single photo of Uncle Pete standing proudly next to a restored 1967 Mustang. Ryan opened the refrigerator and stared at its contents. 3 bottles of beer, leftover Chinese food from Tuesday, a carton of milk that probably expired last week. He grabbed a beer and a frozen dinner, the kind that promised to be ready in 4 minutes and tasted like cardboard mixed with salt. The microwave hummed while Ryan stood at his kitchen window looking down at the empty street. Friday night, 8:15. Across the street, families were settling in for movie nights. Couples were getting dressed for dinner dates. Groups of friends were heading out to bars and restaurants, their laughter floating up through the autumn air. Ryan took a long pull from his beer and tried not to think about Sarah. Sarah Wilson. Sarah Thompson for exactly 18 months. The woman who had walked into his life like sunshine breaking through storm clouds, who had made him believe that maybe a grease monkey from the wrong side of town could have something beautiful. She'd been a teacher at the elementary school down the street. Brought her car in for an oil change on a rainy Tuesday morning, wearing a yellow dress that made her red hair look like fire. Ryan had fallen in love with her laugh before he even knew her name. For 2 years they'd built something that felt real. Sarah would come by the shop after school, sitting on the old couch in the waiting area, while Ryan finished up with customers. She'd grade papers and ask about his day, genuinely interested in stories about Mrs. Chen's ancient Corolla, or the teenager who was saving up to buy his first car. They'd gotten married on a Saturday in October, just a small ceremony at City Hall, with Uncle Pete as the witness. Sarah had worn a simple white dress and carried sunflowers. Ryan had never felt so proud, so complete, so sure that his life was finally heading in the right direction. The divorce papers had arrived on a Tuesday. Ryan found them on the kitchen table when he came upstairs for lunch next to a cup of coffee that was still warm. Sarah's neat handwriting covered a single sheet of notebook paper. Ryan, I can't do this anymore. I thought I could, but I can't. I need more than this. I need someone who can give me a real life, not just survival. I'm 28 years old and I feel like I'm drowning. You're a good man, but you're not enough for me. I deserve better than a life of struggle and grease stains and wondering if we'll ever have anything more than this. I've taken half of our savings. Consider it a fair trade for 2 years of my life. Don't look for me. Sarah. That had been 18 months ago. Ryan hadn't dated since. Hadn't even thought about it, really. What was the point? Sarah was right. He was just a mechanic. He fixed other people's problems for $40 an hour and went home to an empty apartment above a shop that barely paid the bills. The microwave beeped, pulling Ryan back to the present. He carried his dinner to the couch and turned on the television, cycling through channels until he found the old movie he'd seen a dozen times. Something familiar and safe, where he knew exactly how it would end. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. Ryan glanced at it, expecting to see a text from his mother, or maybe Mrs. Chen asking if he could look at her car again this weekend. Instead, he saw a name he hadn't seen in 12 years. Derek Matthews. Ryan stared at the screen for a long moment. Derek Matthews from Roosevelt High School. Derek Matthews, who drove a brand new BMW to school every day while Ryan rode the city bus. Derek Matthews, who dated cheerleaders and threw parties in his parents' mansion while Ryan worked weekends at Uncle Pete's shop. Derek Matthews, who had never spoken to Ryan beyond the occasional nod in the hallway. Ryan opened the message. Hey Ryan, remember me from high school? I've been thinking about old times and realized we lost touch. I have this friend who's perfect for you. She's smart, beautiful, and really wants to meet you. Dinner at Meridian tomorrow at 7. I already made the reservation. Her name is Isabella. You won't regret this, trust me. It's time you met someone who appreciates a good man. Ryan read the message 3 times, his frozen dinner growing cold in his lap. Derek Matthews setting him up on a blind date. Derek Matthews remembering he existed. It didn't make sense, but it had been 18 months since Sarah left. 18 months of microwave dinners and empty weekends. 18 months of watching his life tick by one lonely day at a time. His mother had been calling more often lately, her voice carefully casual when she asked if he was seeing anyone. Martha Thompson was 72 years old and worried about her son in the way only mothers could worry. She'd loved Sarah like a daughter and cried when she heard about the divorce. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe Derek had grown up matured, become the kind of person who thought about old classmates and wanted to help. Maybe this Isabella was exactly what Ryan needed to start believing in possibilities again. Ryan typed back quickly before he could change his mind. Sure sounds good. Thanks for thinking of me. He sent the message and immediately wondered if he'd made a mistake. But it was too late now. Tomorrow night he would put on his best shirt and try to remember how to talk to a woman who wasn't asking about brake pads or transmission fluid. For the first time in 18 months, Ryan Thompson allowed himself to hope. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that at that exact moment, Derek Matthews was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. He actually said yes. Derek Matthews held his phone up for his friends to see his perfectly white teeth gleaming in a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. He was stretched out on his leather sectional sofa, a glass of wine that cost more than Ryan's monthly grocery budget balanced on his chest. The penthouse apartment looked like something out of a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stunning view of the city lights. Modern art hung on walls painted in carefully chosen neutral tones. Everything was expensive, tasteful, and completely devoid of personality, just like Derek himself. Trevor Ross snatched the phone from Derek's hand, reading Ryan's response with the kind of glee usually reserved for children pulling wings off butterflies. Oh, this is going to be beautiful. Can you imagine Ryan Thompson actually thinks someone like Isabella Hart would be interested in a grease monkey, the third man in the room? Austin Blake was already scrolling through his own phone, pulling up social media profiles. I found him. Look at this. He turned his screen toward the others, showing Ryan's sparse Facebook profile. The profile picture was at least 3 years old, taken at some company picnic. Ryan was smiling, but even in the photo he looked tired, worn down by life in a way that men their age shouldn't look. God, he looks exactly like he did in high school, Austin said with a sneer. Still wearing clothes from Walmart, still looking like he crawled out from under a car. Derek took another sip of wine, savoring both the vintage and the anticipation. Isabella Hart, daughter of William Hart, CEO of Hart Industries. 27 years old, blonde, beautiful, and worth approximately $50 million. She's perfect for this. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. The three men had known each other since prep school, bonded by shared privilege and a complete lack of empathy for anyone outside their circle. They'd spent their 20s climbing corporate ladders, building investment portfolios, and refining their ability to look down on everyone else. Derek worked at Kensington Financial, specializing in mergers and acquisitions. It was the kind of job that required expensive suits, Swiss watches, and the ability to destroy lives with a signature. He was good at it, mostly because he genuinely enjoyed watching other people fail. Trevor managed his trust fund and called it a career. Austin worked in real estate, selling multi-million-dollar properties to people who had more money than sense. Together they represented everything wrong with inherited wealth and unearned confidence. They'd been drinking since 6, celebrating Austin's latest sale, when Derek had gotten the brilliant idea to look up old high school classmates on social media. The plan had evolved naturally, the way cruelty often does among people who have never faced real consequences. "So how does this work?" Trevor asked, refilling his wine glass from a bottle that cost $400. "We just watch from across the restaurant while she destroys him." Derek's smile widened. "Better than that. I've already talked to Isabella. Well, her assistant anyway. Told them I was organizing a charity mixer, wanted to introduce her to some eligible bachelors. She thinks this is a legitimate setup. But it's not," Austin said, catching on quickly. "She doesn't know about the joke." "Exactly." Derek pulled up Isabella's Instagram profile, scrolling through photos of charity galas and business conferences. "Look at her. Designer everything, private schools, country club membership. She's never been within 10 feet of someone like Ryan Thompson. The minute she sees him walk into Meridian in his bargain store clothes, she'll realize what's happening." And then Trevor was practically bouncing with anticipation. "And then she'll either laugh in his face or make some excuse to leave. Either way, we film the whole thing." Derek held up his phone, already imagining the viral video that would make them social media famous. Imagine the caption: "Poor mechanic thinks he has a chance with billionaire heiress. Watch what happens next." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual efficiency. They weren't just planning to humiliate Ryan for their own entertainment. They were planning to destroy him publicly, to turn his hope into a joke that strangers would share and laugh at. Austin was already planning the technical details. "I'll sit at the table next to theirs. Get good audio. Trevor, you position yourself near the door for the wide shots. Derek can handle the close-ups. What if she doesn't react the way we think?" Trevor asked. "What if she's nice to him?" Derek's laugh was cold as winter rain. "Isabella Hart. Please, she's society royalty. She dates senators' sons and tech billionaires. Trust me, she'll take one look at Ryan's calloused hands and run screaming back to her daddy's money." They spent another hour planning, working out camera angles and timing. They discussed which social media platforms would give them the most views, how to edit the footage for maximum humiliation, what hashtags would make the video trend. None of them questioned whether they should do this. None of them considered how it might affect Ryan, who was probably lying in bed at that moment, nervous and excited about the possibility of connection. None of them wondered if maybe they'd outgrown the casual cruelty that had made them popular in high school. They were 30 years old, but in their hearts they were still 17. Still the boys who had made other kids' lives miserable because they could, because their parents' money protected them from consequences. Derek finished his wine and stood up, stretching like a satisfied cat. "Gentlemen, tomorrow night we're going to create internet gold. Ryan Thompson is about to learn that some people stay in their lane for a reason." Trevor and Austin gathered their coats, already planning their Saturday night around editing and uploading the footage they would capture. They shook hands like businessmen closing a deal, partners in an enterprise built on someone else's pain. After his friends left, Derek stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, Ryan Thompson was probably lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the possibility of love. Somewhere out there, Isabella Hart was going through her calendar, preparing for what she thought was a legitimate introduction to an eligible bachelor. Neither of them knew they were being set up to star in Derek's cruel theater. Derek poured himself another glass of wine and raised it in a toast to his own cleverness. Tomorrow night he would remind the world that there were still lines that couldn't be crossed, that some people belonged in certain places, and others knew better than to reach too high. He went to sleep smiling, dreaming of viral videos and social media fame, completely unaware that he was about to learn a lesson about assumptions and the price of underestimating other people's worth. Ryan stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, wondering if he could somehow transform himself into the kind of man who belonged at a place called Meridian. The restaurant's website had been a mistake to look at. White tablecloths, crystal chandeliers, entrees. That cost more than Ryan typically spent on groceries in a week. The kind of place where people wore watches that cost more than his truck and talked about wine like it was literature. He'd been standing in front of his closet for 20 minutes trying to figure out what a mechanic wore to dinner with a woman named Isabella. His wardrobe consisted mainly of work shirts, blue jeans, and exactly one dress shirt that he'd worn to Uncle Pete's funeral 3 years ago. The funeral shirt was clean but wrinkled, and when Ryan held it up to the light, he could see where the moths had been at it. Small holes near the collar, a stain on the cuff that might have been from the reception afterward. This wasn't going to work. Ryan grabbed his keys and drove to the nearest department store, the kind of place where everything was affordable because nothing was particularly good. The men's section smelled like sizing and artificial air freshener. Fluorescent lights made everyone look sickly and pale. He found himself overwhelmed by choices he'd never had to make. What was the difference between a dress shirt and a casual shirt? Were khakis dressy enough, or did he need actual dress pants? Should he buy a tie, and if so, what color went with cream? The saleswoman who approached him was about his mother's age, with kind eyes and sensible shoes. She took one look at his confused expression and immediately understood the situation. "Special occasion?" she asked gently. "Dinner date," Ryan admitted. "Somewhere fancy. I don't really know what I'm doing." She smiled and led him through the store like a patient teacher. They settled on a cream-colored button-down shirt that didn't require dry cleaning. Dark khaki pants that were nicer than his work clothes, but not so formal that he'd feel like he was playing dress-up, and a simple brown belt that almost matched his only good pair of shoes. The total came to $87.32. Ryan's checking account had exactly $412 in it until his next customer payments came in. Spending almost a quarter of his available cash on clothes for one evening felt reckless, but he handed over his debit card anyway. "You look nice," the saleswoman said, as he tried everything on in the fitting room. She's lucky to be having dinner with such a thoughtful man. Ryan hoped she was right. Back home, he hung his new clothes carefully in the closet and spent the rest of the afternoon trying not to think too hard about the evening ahead. He cleaned the apartment even though no one would see it. He organized his tools even though they were already organized. He changed the oil in his truck even though it didn't need changing. At 5 o'clock, he called his mother. Martha Thompson had been a widow for 8 years, living in the same small house where Ryan had grown up. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "Ryan, honey, how are you?" "Good, Mom." "Listen, I wanted to tell you something. I have a date tonight." The silence on the other end stretched just long enough for Ryan to picture his mother's face lighting up with the first hope she'd felt for him since Sarah left. "Oh, Ryan, that's wonderful. Tell me about her. Her name is Isabella. I don't know much about her yet, but she seems nice." "Derek Matthews set us up. Derek from high school." Martha's voice carried a note of surprise. "You two weren't particularly close, were you?" "No, but people change. Maybe he thought we'd be good for each other." Martha was quiet for a moment, and Ryan could almost hear her choosing her words carefully. "Just be yourself, honey. You're a good man with a kind heart. Any woman would be lucky to have you." "Thanks, Mom. I should probably get ready." "Call me tomorrow, will you? I want to hear all about it." Ryan promised he would, and hung up the phone feeling both better and worse. Better because his mother's faith in him never wavered, worse because he was terrified of disappointing her again. He showered for the second time that day, scrubbing his hands with the pumice soap he kept for getting grease stains out. His palms were raw by the time he finished, but there were still traces of oil under his fingernails that wouldn't come out. 12 years of working with his hands had left permanent marks that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Getting dressed felt like putting on a costume. The new shirt was stiffer than his usual clothes, the pants a little loose in the waist because he'd been too embarrassed to ask the saleswoman to measure him properly. He looked at himself in the full-length mirror and saw a man trying too hard to be something he wasn't. But maybe that was okay. Maybe sometimes you had to try to be better than you were. Ryan's truck needed 3 tries to start, and the engine made a clicking noise that he'd been meaning to investigate for the past month. He drove slowly through the early evening traffic, giving himself plenty of time to find the restaurant and maybe sit in the parking lot for a few minutes to work up his courage. Meridian was in the part of the city where Ryan never went, where the streets were wider and cleaner, where the cars parked along the curbs cost more than most people's houses. The restaurant itself was a converted mansion, all white columns and brick walls with soft lighting spilling from tall windows onto manicured gardens. Ryan sat in his truck for 10 minutes watching well-dressed couples walk through the front door. The men wore suits that fit perfectly, moved with the confidence that came from knowing they belonged. The women looked like they'd stepped out of magazines, their hair and makeup flawless, their jewelry catching the light from the entrance chandelier. He thought about starting his truck and driving home. He could call Derek, make up some excuse about feeling sick or having a work emergency. He could go back to his apartment and his microwave dinner and his quiet Saturday evening. But then he thought about his mother's excited voice, about the hope in her words when he'd told her about the date. He thought about Uncle Pete, who had always told him that backing down from a challenge was the only real failure. Most of all, he thought about Sarah's note. "You're not enough for me. I deserve better." Maybe Isabella would think the same thing. Maybe she'd take one look at him and realize she'd made a mistake. But at least he'd tried. At least he'd been brave enough to walk through that door and find out. Ryan checked his reflection in the rearview mirror one more time, straightened his collar, and got out of the truck. The valet looked surprised when Ryan handed him the keys to a 10-year-old pickup truck, but he was professional enough not to comment. Ryan watched his truck disappear behind the building, hoping it would start when the evening was over. The entrance doors were heavy glass and brass, the kind that whispered expensive with every detail. Ryan pushed them open and stepped into a world he'd only seen in movies. Crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings. Rich carpet muffled the sound of conversation and clinking silverware. The hostess stand was mahogany polished to a mirror shine, staffed by a woman who looked like she could be on television. She glanced up as Ryan approached, and he saw her eyes flicker over his carefully chosen outfit with the kind of assessment that left him feeling transparent. Her smile was professional, but cool, the sort of expression that suggested she'd dealt with people who didn't quite belong before. "Good evening," she said. "Do you have a reservation?" Ryan cleared his throat. Yes, under Matthews. I'm meeting someone named Isabella. The hostess's eyebrows rose almost imperceptibly. Of course. Right this way, please. She led him through the dining room, and Ryan felt every eye in the place tracking his movement. Conversations paused as he passed. He heard whispers that might have been about him or might have been his imagination. The table she led him to was near the center of the room, visible from every angle. 2 place settings, cream napkins folded into perfect triangles, water glasses that sparkled under the chandelier light. "Your server will be right with you," the hostess said. "Miss Hart should be arriving shortly." Ryan sat down carefully, afraid of disturbing the precise arrangement of silverware and plates. He looked around the room and felt his stomach drop as he recognized a familiar face in the corner. Derek Matthews sat at a large table with 2 other men, all of them dressed in expensive suits, all of them watching Ryan with barely contained amusement. Derek raised his wine glass in a mock toast, his smile sharp as a blade. That's when Ryan knew. This wasn't a setup for romance. It was a setup for humiliation. He was the joke, the entertainment, the poor mechanic who'd been foolish enough to think he deserved to be here. He started to stand up, ready to walk out with whatever dignity he had left, when the restaurant doors opened and a woman walked in. Even from across the room, even through his embarrassment and growing anger, Ryan could see that she was beautiful beyond anything he'd imagined. Blonde hair that caught the light, a figure that made every man in the restaurant notice, and a presence that commanded attention without demanding it. She was exactly the kind of woman who would never look twice at someone like him. And she was walking straight toward his table. The entrance doors of Meridian opened like the parting of curtains on a stage, and Isabella Hart stepped into the restaurant's golden light, as if she'd been born to it. She was a vision in red silk, but not the kind of obvious beauty that demanded attention through sheer force. Instead, she possessed an elegance that drew every eye in the room through subtle magnetism. Her blonde hair had been styled in soft waves that moved like water with each step, catching the chandelier light and throwing it back in shimmers of gold and honey. The dress she wore was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Red silk that hugged her figure without being obvious about it, cut with the precision that only came from designers who understood that true sophistication whispered rather than shouted. It fell to just below her knees, revealing legs that seemed to go on forever, before disappearing into heels that probably cost more than Ryan's monthly rent. But what made every person in Meridian pause their conversations wasn't just Isabella's striking beauty. It was the confidence with which she carried herself, the unmistakable bearing of someone who had never questioned her right to enter any room anywhere in the world. She moved like royalty, not through arrogance, but through the quiet certainty that came from a lifetime of knowing she belonged. Diamond earrings caught the light with every turn of her head, simple enough to be tasteful, expensive enough to announce her status to anyone who understood such things. A pearl bracelet on her left wrist was the only other jewelry she wore, but it was enough. On Isabella Hart, anything more would have been gilding the lily. Yet despite all this perfection, all this obvious wealth and breeding, she wasn't alone. The little girl holding her hand was like a miniature version of her mother, dressed in a red silk dress that matched Isabella's perfectly. Sophie Hart had inherited her mother's blonde hair, though hers fell in ringlets that bounced with each step. Her shoes were tiny versions of grown-up heels, and she wore a pearl bracelet that was clearly meant to match her mother's. But where Isabella moved with practiced grace, Sophie bounced with the irrepressible energy of a 3-year-old who found the entire world fascinating. Her wide blue eyes took in every detail of the restaurant's grandeur, from the crystal chandeliers to the elaborate flower arrangements, with the kind of wonder that only children could feel. The contrast between mother and daughter was striking. Isabella's beauty was refined, polished, perfect. Sophie's was pure and unguarded, the kind of natural charm that made everyone she encountered smile involuntarily. The hostess who approached them was the same woman who had looked at Ryan with barely concealed disdain minutes earlier. But her entire demeanor changed when she recognized Isabella Hart. Her spine straightened. Her smile became genuine, and her voice took on a warmth that had been completely absent during Ryan's arrival. "Miss Hart," she said, her tone carrying just the right balance of respect and familiarity. "How wonderful to see you again. We have your table ready." "Thank you, Margaret," Isabella replied, her voice carrying the kind of casual warmth that suggested she remembered everyone's name and cared enough to use it. "I hope you don't mind that I brought Sophie tonight. I know children aren't typically in the dining room during evening service." The hostess Margaret looked briefly uncomfortable. Meridian had strict policies about children in the main dining room after 6 o'clock. It was one of the things that maintained their exclusive atmosphere, the guarantee that conversations would remain sophisticated and uninterrupted by the chaos that children could bring. But Isabella Hart wasn't just any customer. She was the daughter of William Hart, whose company had catered several major events at the restaurant. More than that, she was exactly the kind of patron that Meridian built its reputation on. Sophisticated, wealthy, and influential enough that accommodating her wishes was always good business. Of course not, Margaret said, though her smile was slightly strained. "We're delighted to have both of you this evening." "Wonderful," Isabella said, but there was steel underneath the silk of her voice, a quiet authority that suggested she had expected no other answer. "Sophie comes everywhere with me. Don't you, sweetheart?" Sophie nodded enthusiastically, then looked up at the hostess with the kind of direct gaze that children specialized in. "Your restaurant is very pretty. Do you have chicken nuggets?" Margaret's professional composure wavered slightly at this question, which was probably the first time anyone had asked about chicken nuggets in Meridian's 50-year history. "I'm sure our chef can prepare something appropriate for young Miss Hart." Sophie beamed. "I like it here already." As Margaret began leading them through the dining room toward Ryan's table, every conversation in the restaurant shifted to accommodate their passage. Men looked up from their wine glasses to admire Isabella's elegance. Women assessed her dress, her jewelry, her shoes. With the kind of detailed evaluation that occurred whenever someone truly striking entered their space. But it wasn't just Isabella's beauty that commanded attention. It was the unmistakable aura of wealth and breeding that surrounded her like expensive perfume. Everyone in the restaurant could sense that she belonged to that rarefied class of people who shaped the world rather than being shaped by it. The whispered conversations that followed in their wake weren't cruel as they had been when Ryan entered. Instead, they were speculative, curious about who Isabella Hart was meeting for dinner and why she had brought her daughter to such an unusual setting. "She must be meeting someone very important," one woman murmured to her dinner companion. "Perhaps a business dinner," suggested another. "Though bringing a child seems odd for that." "Maybe it's personal," offered a third voice. "She's been single since her daughter was born. Everyone's been wondering when she'd start dating again." Isabella heard none of these whispered speculations, or if she did, she gave no sign of caring. Her attention was focused entirely on the path ahead, where she could see a man sitting alone at a table in the center of the dining room. Even from across the room, she could tell that Ryan Thompson was exactly what Derek Matthews had promised he would be. Working class, out of his element, dressed in clothes that clearly came from department stores rather than tailors, his posture was rigid with discomfort, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, as if he was afraid of disturbing the precise arrangement of crystal and silverware on his table. But there was something else in his bearing that Derek hadn't mentioned, something that made Isabella slow her pace slightly as she studied him more carefully. Despite his obvious discomfort, despite the fact that he was clearly in a world where he didn't belong, Ryan Thompson hadn't tried to make himself smaller or invisible. He sat straight in his chair, met the stares of other diners with quiet dignity, and carried himself with the kind of honest pride that came from knowing his own worth, even if others didn't recognize it. Isabella's eyes flicked briefly to the corner table, where Derek Matthews sat with his friends. Phones positioned for optimal recording angles, wine glasses raised in anticipatory celebration. She had dealt with Derek's type her entire life. Men who thought wealth was a substitute for character, who believed that inherited privilege made them superior to people who actually worked for their living. The irony of Derek's cruel plan was that he had no idea who he was actually dealing with. Not just Isabella, whose own opinions about class and worth had been shaped by very different experiences than he assumed, and not just Ryan Thompson, who Derek had dismissed as an easy target for humiliation. Derek Matthews was about to learn that some assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. Sophie, meanwhile, was taking in everything around them with the unfiltered enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who had never learned to hide her emotions. She pointed at the chandeliers, whispered excitedly about the flowers on each table, and waved at other diners who smiled back at her infectious joy. But when she spotted Ryan sitting alone at their destination table, something in her expression shifted. Even at 3 years old, Sophie Hart had inherited her mother's ability to read people quickly and accurately. She saw past Ryan's department store clothes and working man's hands to something that resonated with her young but surprisingly wise heart. "Mummy," she said, tugging on Isabella's hand. "Is that him? Is that the man we're having dinner with?" "Yes, sweetheart," Isabella replied, never taking her eyes off Ryan. "That's Ryan Thompson." Sophie studied Ryan for another moment, taking in his gentle eyes, his patient posture, the way he smiled slightly when he noticed her looking at him. Then, with the kind of instant decision that only children could make, she let go of her mother's hand and ran straight toward him. Her little heels clicked on the marble floor like tiny bells, and every person in the restaurant turned to watch this miniature princess charge across the dining room with complete fearlessness. She reached Ryan's table before Isabella could react, before the hostess could intervene, before anyone could stop her. Without hesitation, without shyness, Sophie grabbed Ryan's hand with both of her small ones and looked up at him with the kind of trust that adults had long since learned to be cautious about giving. "Hi," she said, her voice clear and confident. "I'm Sophie. Mummy said we were meeting someone nice today. Are you nice?" The entire restaurant held its breath, waiting to see how this working man would respond to the daughter of one of the city's most powerful families. At the corner table, Derek Matthews leaned forward with his phone, certain that this moment would provide exactly the kind of class clash footage that would make his video go viral. But Ryan Thompson didn't hesitate for even a second. He knelt down to Sophie's level, bringing his eyes to the same height as hers, and smiled with the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked or practiced. "I try to be," he said simply. "Are you nice?" "Very nice," Sophie announced with absolute certainty. "Mummy says being nice is the most important thing, more important than money or fancy clothes or anything." "Your mummy sounds very smart," Ryan replied, and when he looked up to meet Isabella's eyes over Sophie's head, she saw something in his expression that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "She is," Sophie said proudly. "She's the smartest in the whole world, and she's really good at business. She has meetings all the time, but she still always has time for me because I'm her favorite person." She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping to what she thought was a whisper, but was actually audible to half the restaurant. "But don't tell anyone. It's a secret." Isabella reached them then, and the moment she had been preparing for during the entire walk across the restaurant finally arrived. She extended her hand to Ryan Thompson, this man who Derek Matthews assumed she would reject without a second thought, and smiled with genuine warmth. "You must be Ryan," she said, her voice carrying just enough of her finishing school training to sound refined without being affected. "I'm Isabella, and I apologize for Sophie's enthusiasm. She doesn't believe in personal space or proper introductions." What Isabella didn't say, what Derek Matthews couldn't possibly have known, was that she had spent the last hour researching Ryan Thompson with the thoroughness of someone who made important business decisions for a living. She knew about his reputation for honest work and fair prices. She knew about the customers whose cars he fixed for free when they couldn't afford to pay. She knew about the community center where he volunteered teaching auto repair skills to teenagers. Most importantly, she knew that Derek Matthews had chosen exactly the wrong person to humiliate and exactly the wrong woman to help him do it. "I like him," Sophie announced to the entire restaurant, her small voice carrying with perfect clarity across the suddenly quiet dining room. "He has kind eyes, and he got down to talk to me properly, instead of just looking down from up there." She gestured vaguely toward the height where most adults existed in her world, then added with the brutal honesty that only 3-year-olds possessed, "Most of the men Mommy meets don't like me very much." The words hung in the air like a confession, and Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was true, devastatingly so, but she had never expected her daughter to announce it quite so publicly. The men she typically encountered through business or social functions saw Sophie as an inconvenience at best, an obstacle at worst. Ryan was still kneeling at Sophie's eye level, and Isabella watched his expression shift from surprise to something that looked remarkably like anger on her daughter's behalf. "Well, that's their loss," he said firmly, his voice carrying enough conviction that Sophie's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Any man who doesn't see how lucky your mum is to have you doesn't deserve either one of you." Sophie beamed and threw her arms around Ryan's neck in the kind of spontaneous hug that children gave when they felt completely safe with someone. Over her daughter's shoulder, Isabella saw Derek Matthews lean forward at his corner table, his expression shifting from anticipation to confusion. This wasn't going according to his carefully planned script. The hostess Margaret cleared her throat delicately. "Shall I show you to your table?" Isabella realized they were creating quite a scene, standing in the middle of Meridian's dining room, while every patron watched their interaction with fascination. Sophie was still attached to Ryan like a tiny blonde barnacle, and he seemed perfectly content to let her stay there. "Yes, please," Isabella said. "Sophie, sweetheart, let Ryan stand up so we can sit down." "Do I have to?" Sophie asked, but she released her grip and stepped back. "Can I sit next to him? If Ryan doesn't mind?" Isabella replied, looking at him with a question in her eyes. Ryan straightened his knees, popping slightly from kneeling on the hard floor. "I'd be honored to sit next to Sophie." Margaret led them to the table, which suddenly seemed both too small and too large for this unusual group. Ryan moved to pull out Isabella's chair, a gesture that earned an approving nod from Sophie, who had apparently appointed herself the judge of his manners. "That's good," Sophie informed the restaurant at large. "Mommy says gentlemen always help ladies with their chairs, but most men forget." Ryan helped Sophie into her chair, next boosting her up and adjusting the booster seat that Margaret had quietly provided. His movements were patient and practiced, suggesting he had experience with small children. "Do you have kids?" Sophie asked with her characteristic directness. "No, but I have several customers who bring their children to the shop while I work on their cars. I've learned that little people deserve the same respect as big people." Sophie nodded approvingly. "See, Mommy. He gets it." Isabella settled into her own chair, acutely aware of the attention their table was receiving from the rest of the restaurant. Some diners were frankly staring, fascinated by the unusual sight of the Hart Industries heiress having dinner with a man who clearly didn't belong to their social circle. Others were more discreet, stealing glances, while pretending to focus on their own conversations. At Derek's table in the corner, she could see phones positioned for optimal recording angles, 3 men leaning forward with barely contained excitement, waiting for the moment when she would reveal the cruel punchline they expected. Isabella had spent her entire adult life dealing with men who underestimated her intelligence, who assumed that blonde hair and a famous last name meant she could be easily manipulated. Derek Matthews was about to learn exactly how wrong those assumptions could be. But first, she needed to be honest with Ryan Thompson about what was really happening here. "Ryan," she began, folding her hands on the table and meeting his eyes directly. I need to be completely honest with you about this evening. Ryan's expression didn't change, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. He was preparing himself for disappointment, for the rejection he had probably expected from the moment he walked into Meridian. Derek Matthews contacted me last week. Isabella continued, her voice calm and clear. He told me he was setting up what he called an encounter. He wanted me to come here, meet you, and essentially humiliate you for his entertainment and that of his friends. She nodded toward Derek's table, where 3 men were now leaning forward with obvious interest, phones ready to capture whatever was about to unfold. They planned to film the whole thing and post it on social media. The idea was that I would take one look at you, realize you weren't from my social class, and reject you in the most cruel way possible. Ryan's face flushed deep red, and Isabella saw his hands clench into fists on the table. The humiliation was written clearly across his features, but underneath it she saw something else. Anger not at her, but at the situation itself. "So why are you telling me this?" he asked, his voice tight but controlled. "Why not just do what he wanted? Because Derek Matthews is an idiot who doesn't know nearly as much about me as he thinks he does." Isabella replied, her own anger beginning to show through her composed exterior. "He assumed that because I'm the daughter of a CEO, because I wear expensive clothes and attend charity functions, I would naturally find you beneath me and enjoy making you feel small." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Ryan's face. He was wrong about everything. Sophie, who had been listening to this exchange with the intense focus that children brought to adult conversations they didn't quite understand, suddenly spoke up. "Are those the mean men?" she asked, pointing directly at Derek's table. "The ones who wanted to hurt Ryan's feelings?" "Yes, sweetheart," Isabella said softly. "Those are the mean men." Sophie studied Derek's table for a moment with the serious expression she wore when she was thinking hard about something. Then she turned back to Ryan with a look of fierce determination. "Don't worry," she said, patting his hand with her tiny one. "Mommy won't let them be mean to you. She's very good at making mean people sorry." Isabella couldn't help but smile at her daughter's protective instincts. Sophie had inherited more than just her looks from the Hart family line. Ryan was looking between Isabella and Sophie with an expression that suggested he was still processing what he'd been told. The relief of knowing he wasn't going to be humiliated was warring with the anger of knowing that had been the plan all along. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "If you knew this was supposed to be a cruel prank, why did you come? Why not just tell Derek to get lost?" "Several reasons," Isabella replied. "First, I was curious about the man Derek had chosen as his target. I did some research on you, Ryan Thompson. I know about Morrison's auto repair, about how you took over your uncle's business and kept all his employees, even though downsizing would have been more profitable. I know about your reputation for honest work and fair prices. I know how you fixed Mrs. Chen's car for free when you found out she was choosing between paying you and buying groceries." Ryan's eyebrows rose. "How did you find all that out?" "I have my methods," Isabella said with a slight smile. "The point is, Derek chose you because he thought you'd be an easy target for humiliation. What he didn't realize is that he was actually introducing me to exactly the kind of man I've been hoping to meet." "Really?" The word came out softer than Ryan had intended, carrying more hope than he'd meant to reveal. "Really," Isabella confirmed. "Ryan, I get asked out constantly by men who see my last name and think dollar signs. Men who drive cars that cost more than most people's houses and say all the right things but treat service staff like they're invisible and see my daughter as an inconvenience to be managed." "That's true," Sophie chimed in. "There was this one man, what was his name again?" "Mommy Brad Kensington," Isabella said with obvious distaste. "Right," Sophie turned to Ryan with the air of someone sharing important intelligence. "He said children should be seen and not heard. So I told him that was stupid and that he shouldn't be seen or heard either." Ryan couldn't help but laugh at Sophie's matter-of-fact delivery. You told him that? Yep, Sophie said proudly. Mummy said it wasn't polite, but Grandpa said it was accurate. Isabella's smile was both proud and slightly embarrassed. Sophie is very protective of her opinions about people. She's also remarkably good at reading character. Like how she knew you were nice right away. Sophie said to Ryan. I can always tell. The mean ones look at me like I'm a problem. The nice ones look at me like I'm a person. Her simple wisdom hit Ryan harder than any complex explanation could have. This 3-year-old had articulated something profound about human nature, with the clarity that only children possessed. You sound like a very smart judge of character, he told Sophie. I am, she agreed without false modesty. And I like you. You're not fake like the other ones. From across the restaurant, Derek's voice carried over the ambient noise, sharp with frustration. What the hell is taking so long? She was supposed to shut this down by now. Isabella's expression hardened as she glanced toward Derek's table. Those men think they understand how the world works, she said quietly. They think wealth automatically creates superiority, that accidents of birth determine worth. They're about to learn that some assumptions can be very expensive mistakes. Ryan found himself studying Isabella's face, seeing past the obvious beauty to the intelligence and strength underneath. This wasn't the shallow materialistic woman Derek had expected her to be. This was someone with depth, complexity, and apparently a protective streak when it came to people she cared about. And somehow, impossibly, she seemed to be including him in that category. So what happens now? Ryan asked. When we leave here, I mean. They're obviously going to say things, post things online, probably. Let them try, Isabella said with quiet confidence. Derek Matthews has no idea who he's actually dealing with. Neither do his friends. She reached across the table and covered Ryan's hand with hers, the gesture simple but electric. They planned this evening to teach you a lesson about staying in your place, she said softly. Instead, I think they're about to learn a very different lesson entirely. But before Isabella could explain further, their waiter approached the table. He was impeccably dressed in the restaurant's signature black uniform, his movements practiced and professional. His name tag read James, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had served Meridian's elite clientele for many years. Good evening, James said, his voice warm but respectful. Miss Hart, it's lovely to see you again. And this must be Sophie. Sophie beamed up at him. Hi, James, do you remember me? Of course I do. You're the young lady who asked me about the chandelier last time you were here. It's very sparkly, Sophie informed Ryan seriously. James told me it has 200 crystals on it. I counted, but I only got to 17 before I got dizzy. James smiled genuinely at Sophie's explanation, then turned his attention to Ryan. And you must be Mr. Thompson. Welcome to Meridian. Can I start you with something to drink this evening? Ryan glanced at the wine list that James offered, and his heart sank. The cheapest bottle cost more than he typically spent on groceries for 2 weeks. He was about to ask for water when Isabella smoothly intervened. We'll have the Domaine Chandon, Isabella said. The 2018 vintage if you have it available. And Sophie will have her usual sparkling apple cider in a champagne flute. Of course, James replied. And would you like to hear about tonight's specials? As James described dishes with names Ryan couldn't pronounce and ingredients he'd never heard of, Ryan found himself studying Isabella more carefully. She listened to the specials with genuine interest, asked intelligent questions about preparation methods, and seemed completely at ease in this world of white tablecloths and crystal glasses. But there was something else underneath her polished exterior. A warmth and authenticity that Derek Matthews had completely missed in his calculations. When James finished describing the specials, Isabella turned to Ryan. What sounds good to you? And please don't worry about the prices. This is my treat. I can't let you pay for dinner, Ryan protested, though the relief in his voice was obvious. Yes, you can, Sophie said matter-of-factly. Mommy always pays when she invites people. It's good manners. Isabella smiled at her daughter's confident assertion. Sophie's right. I invited you, so I'm buying. Besides, Derek was planning to pay for this evening as part of his little show. The least I can do is make sure his credit card actually gets some use. How do you know Derek will pay? Ryan asked. Because I'm about to text him and tell him that if he doesn't pick up the bill for this dinner, along with a generous tip for James, I'll make some phone calls that will ensure his investment firm loses several very important clients. She pulled out her phone and began typing with swift efficiency. Men like Derek think wealth is just about having money. They don't understand that real wealth is about having influence, and influence means knowing which phone calls to make when someone needs to be taught a lesson. As Isabella sent her message, Ryan watched Derek's table from the corner of his eye. He saw Derek check his phone, saw his expression shift from confident amusement to something approaching panic as he read Isabella's text. Derek immediately began typing back, his fingers moving frantically across his phone screen. Within moments, Isabella's phone chimed with his response. "Let's see what Derek has to say," Isabella murmured, opening his message. She read it silently, then looked up at Ryan with a smile that was both beautiful and slightly predatory. "He says he'd be delighted to cover our evening and that he hopes we have a lovely time." Sophie clapped her hands together. "Does that mean the mean men can't be mean anymore? It means they're starting to understand that being mean has consequences," Isabella replied, reaching over to smooth Sophie's hair. "Especially when you're mean to people I care about." The casual way she said it, the implication that she already cared about Ryan after knowing him for less than an hour, made something warm unfurl in his chest. When was the last time someone had stood up for him? When had anyone ever used their influence to protect him instead of diminish him? James returned with their drinks, the champagne properly chilled and poured with ceremony. Sophie's apple cider presented in a crystal flute that made her giggle with delight. After they ordered their meals, the conversation began to flow more naturally. "Tell me about your business," Isabella said, settling back in her chair. "How long have you been running Morrison's? 3 years since Uncle Pete died," Ryan replied. "He owned it for 22 years before that. I grew up in that shop, learning everything from him. He always said that honest work and fair prices would build a reputation worth having." "That's exactly the kind of philosophy my father started with," Isabella said thoughtfully. "He always told me that your reputation is the only thing you truly own. Everything else can be taken away." "What does your father do?" Ryan asked. Then immediately felt foolish. Everyone in the city knew who William Hart was. "He runs Hart Industries," Sophie answered before her mother could respond. "He builds big buildings and helps people with money stuff, and he gives lots of money to help sick kids get better." Isabella smiled at her daughter's simplified but accurate description. "My father started Hart Industries 35 years ago with $1,000 he borrowed from his own uncle. He was the son of a maintenance worker at a downtown office building. Every night after school, he'd go to work with his father, learning how buildings worked from the ground up." Ryan's eyebrows rose. "I didn't know that. The articles I've read about Hart Industries always focus on the business empire, not the background." "That's intentional," Isabella said. "In business, people often respect you more if they think you were born into success rather than built it yourself. It's easier to intimidate competitors if they think wealth and power come naturally to you." "But that's not true," Sophie added. "Grandpa says money doesn't make people good or bad. People make money good or bad." "Your grandfather sounds very wise," Ryan said. "He is. He also said that people who work with their hands build the world that everyone else gets to live in." Sophie looked directly at Ryan as she said this, her young face serious. "Grandpa would like you." The sincerity in Sophie's voice, the matter-of-fact way she delivered what was clearly a carefully remembered lesson from her grandfather, made Ryan feel something he hadn't experienced in years. Acceptance. Not just tolerance or politeness, but genuine acceptance from people whose opinions mattered. "Does your father know you're here tonight?" Ryan asked Isabella. Does he know about Derek's plan? Isabella's smile turned mysterious. My father knows everything that's important. Let's just say that Derek Matthews may find Monday morning at work very interesting. Their meals arrived then, beautifully presented dishes that looked more like art than food. Sophie had insisted on the chicken tender, specially prepared by the chef, while Isabella and Ryan had ordered fish that came with sauces Ryan couldn't identify, but tasted better than anything he'd ever eaten. As they ate, the conversation continued to flow with surprising ease. Isabella talked about growing up in her father's shadow, about learning business principles at the dinner table, about the pressure and privilege that came with the Hart name. People assume that having money makes everything easy, she said, cutting her fish into precise bites. And in many ways it does. I've never worried about paying bills or finding a job, but it also means that everyone wants something from you. Every friendship, every relationship becomes complicated by questions of motivation. How do you know who's genuine? Ryan asked. You learn to read people quickly, Isabella replied. You develop instincts about who sees you as a person versus who sees you as a bank account or a business opportunity. And you treasure the people who treat you normally, who aren't impressed by your last name or intimidated by your money. Like Ryan Sophie announced. He didn't even know who we were when I hugged him. He just thought I was a nice little girl. That's because you are a nice little girl, Ryan said seriously. Probably the nicest I've ever met. Sophie beamed at the compliment, then launched into an elaborate story about her preschool teacher and a classroom hamster named Mr. Whiskers. As she talked, gesturing enthusiastically with her small hands, Ryan found himself completely charmed by her unfiltered joy and enthusiasm. Isabella watched Ryan's interaction with her daughter with growing amazement. Most of the men she encountered tolerated Sophie, at best treated her like an obstacle to be managed, while they pursued Isabella's attention and money. But Ryan was genuinely engaged with Sophie, listening to her stories with the same attention he'd given to Isabella's business discussions. She's not usually this talkative with strangers, Isabella said softly, while Sophie paused to take a drink of her sparkling cider. I don't think she sees me as a stranger, Ryan replied, watching Sophie arrange her vegetables into what appeared to be a garden on her plate. Children are good judges of character. They don't have all the filters that adults develop. That's true, Isabella agreed. Sophie has never warmed up to anyone this quickly. Usually it takes weeks for her to feel comfortable enough to chatter like this. Maybe it's because I'm not trying to impress her, Ryan said thoughtfully. I'm not trying to win her approval so I can get closer to you. I just think she's a remarkable little person who deserves to be heard. The simple honesty of his statement hit Isabella harder than any practiced charm could have. This was exactly what had been missing from every other relationship she'd attempted since Sophie was born. Men who saw her daughter as a person rather than a complication. As if sensing the importance of the moment, Sophie looked up from her vegetable garden and studied both adults with the intense focus she reserved for important decisions. Are you going to be friends? She asked directly. Because I think you should be friends. You both smile with your eyes when you talk to each other. Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. Her 3-year-old daughter had apparently inherited the Hart family ability to read people and situations with uncomfortable accuracy. I'd like to be friends, Ryan said, simply looking at Isabella rather than Sophie. If Isabella would like that too. I would, Isabella replied, her voice softer than she'd intended. I really would. Good, Sophie said with satisfaction. Now can we order dessert? James said they have chocolate cake that's taller than me. As James presented the dessert menu with elaborate descriptions of artistic confections, Ryan found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't experienced since before Sarah left. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from serious topics to shared laughter as Sophie provided running commentary on everything around them. Isabella was nothing like the shallow, materialistic woman Derek had expected her to be. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and surprisingly down to earth, despite her obvious sophistication. More importantly, she treated him like an equal rather than a curiosity or a charity case. The chocolate cake, when it arrived, was indeed taller than Sophie and decorated with spun sugar that looked like art. Sophie's eyes widened to cartoon proportions as James set it in front of her. "That's the most beautiful cake in the whole world," she breathed, then looked up at Ryan with complete seriousness. "You have to help me eat it. It's too important for one person." As they shared dessert, Isabella found herself studying Ryan's face in the candlelight. His hands, calloused and permanently stained from years of honest work, were gentle as he helped Sophie navigate her enormous slice of cake. His laugh was genuine when Sophie got chocolate frosting on her nose. His attention to her daughter never felt forced or calculated. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it. Not another wealthy bachelor with impeccable credentials and empty charm, but a man who saw her daughter as a blessing rather than a burden, who valued character over connections, who treated service staff with respect and didn't need to name-drop or show off to feel important. Derek Matthews, in his cruel attempt to humiliate a decent man, had accidentally introduced Isabella to exactly the kind of person she'd hoped to find. As the evening wound down and James brought the check, Isabella discreetly handled the payment, while Sophie dozed in her chair, exhausted by excitement and chocolate. Ryan started to protest again, but Isabella silenced him with a look. "This was my choice," she said firmly. "Derek planned to pay for a humiliation. Instead, he got to pay for one of the most enjoyable evenings I've had in years." "So what happens now?" Ryan asked the same question he'd posed earlier, but with a different tone. Hope had replaced resignation in his voice. "Now," Isabella said, gathering her purse and gently waking Sophie, "we exchange phone numbers and plan to see each other again. Soon." "Tomorrow?" Sophie asked, instantly alert despite her previous drowsiness. "Let's start with a phone call." Isabella laughed. "But yes, very soon." As they prepared to leave, Isabella glanced toward Derek's table in the corner. The three men were slumped in their chairs like deflated balloons, their phones put away, their expressions ranging from confused to worried. Derek's evening of cruel entertainment had become his own expensive lesson in underestimating people, and based on the text messages Isabella had been receiving from her father during dinner, Derek's education was just beginning. But that was a problem for Monday morning. Tonight was about new beginnings, unexpected connections, and the discovery that sometimes the people who try to hurt you end up giving you exactly what you needed most. As they walked toward the restaurant exit, Sophie, holding both Ryan's hand and Isabella, realized that Derek Matthews had no idea what he'd actually accomplished tonight. He'd set out to humiliate a good man, and instead had introduced that man to the family who would change his life forever. The valet brought Ryan's truck around, and Isabella watched his face carefully as he tipped the young man and helped them into the vehicle. There was no embarrassment about his 10-year-old pickup, no apology for the manual windows or the small tear in the passenger seat. This was who he was, and he wasn't ashamed of it. As Ryan drove them to Isabella's car, Sophie chatted excitedly from the middle of the bench seat about their evening. She'd had chocolate cake taller than herself, met a nice man who listened to her stories, and spent an evening in a restaurant with chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds. For Sophie, it had been a perfect night. For Isabella, it had been a revelation. And for Ryan, it had been the beginning of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he was enough exactly as he was. Derek's cruel plan had backfired in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined. Instead of proving that people should stay in their designated social classes, he'd demonstrated that real connection transcended artificial boundaries. As they pulled into the parking lot where Isabella's BMW waited, Sophie was already making plans for their next meeting. Ryan helped Isabella transfer her daughter's car seat, their hands brushing as they worked together to secure the straps. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility and the recognition of something worth pursuing. "I had a wonderful time tonight," Isabella said softly. "Both of us did." So did I, Ryan replied. More wonderful than I expected when this evening started. Sophie, now buckled into her car seat in Isabella's car, called through the open window. Ryan, will you come to my birthday party? It's in 3 weeks and Mummy always makes the best cake. If your mummy invites me, I'd be honored to come, Ryan said, making Sophie squeal with delight. Consider yourself invited, Isabella said, her smile warm and genuine. And Ryan, thank you for being exactly who you are. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like that's not enough. As Isabella drove away with Sophie waving enthusiastically from the back seat, Ryan stood in the parking lot and watched their tail lights disappear into the night. His phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from Isabella. Thank you for a perfect evening. Call me tomorrow. Ryan saved her number in his phone and typed back. Wild horses couldn't stop me. As he drove home through the quiet city streets, Ryan reflected on how completely his life had changed in the span of a single evening. He'd walked into Meridian expecting humiliation and found something he'd stopped believing was possible. Hope. Meanwhile, across town in his penthouse apartment, Derek Matthews was pacing his living room like a caged animal. His phone had been ringing constantly since dinner. Ended text messages arriving from business contacts, social connections, and professional acquaintances. The messages all carried variations of the same theme. William Hart was asking questions about Derek's character and judgment. Hart Industries was reconsidering their business relationship with Kensington Financial. Perhaps Derek should consider whether his current position was a good fit for someone with his demonstrated lack of professional discretion. Derek's friends Trevor and Austin had left hours ago, suddenly remembering other commitments when it became clear that their evening of entertainment had become a networking nightmare. The video footage they'd planned to use for social media humiliation was now nothing more than evidence of their own cruelty. As Derek poured himself another drink and tried to calculate how much tonight's entertainment was going to cost him professionally, he still didn't understand what had gone wrong. He'd chosen Ryan Thompson as a target because he seemed like an easy mark, a working-class mechanic who would be out of his depth at a place like Meridian, easily intimidated and humiliated by someone from Isabella Hart's social class. He'd assumed Isabella would share his casual cruelty, would see Ryan as beneath her, and react with predictable disdain. Derek had been wrong about everything. Ryan Thompson wasn't weak or easily intimidated. He was a man of quiet strength and genuine character. Exactly the kind of person who impressed people like William Hart, who had built his own empire from similar humble beginnings. Isabella Hart wasn't the shallow, materialistic woman Derek had expected. She was intelligent, principled, and perfectly capable of recognizing character when she saw it. Most importantly, Derek had underestimated the power of genuine connection over artificial social boundaries. As his phone buzzed with another ominous message from a business contact, Derek Matthews began to realize that some assumptions could be very expensive mistakes. Sunday morning arrived with autumn sunshine streaming through the windows of Ryan's apartment. For the first time in 18 months, he woke up with something to look forward to. Isabella had said to call her today, and Sophie had extracted a promise that he'd come to her birthday party. Ryan made coffee and sat at his kitchen table with his phone in his hand, nervous about making the call, but excited in a way he'd forgotten was possible. At exactly 10 o'clock, he dialed Isabella's number. She answered on the second ring. Good morning, Ryan. I was hoping you'd call early. Sophie's been asking about you since she woke up. Good morning, Isabella. How did she sleep after all that chocolate cake like a rock? But she dreamed about chandeliers and chocolate cake taller than buildings. She wants to know if you'd like to come to the park with us this afternoon. Nothing fancy, just the playground and maybe ice cream. I'd love that, Ryan said, meaning every word. That afternoon, Ryan found himself pushing Sophie on the swings at Riverside Park, while Isabella sat on a nearby bench, watching them with a smile that made his chest feel tight with happiness. Sophie had insisted that Ryan needed to see how high she could swing, and she provided running commentary on her aerial achievements. "Look how high I'm going," she called out, her blonde curls streaming behind her like ribbons. "I'm almost flying." "You are flying," Ryan called back. "You're the best flyer I've ever seen." Isabella watched this interaction with growing amazement. Sophie had accepted Ryan into their lives with the instant trust that children reserved for people they felt truly safe with. And Ryan responded to Sophie's enthusiasm with genuine enjoyment rather than adult tolerance. When Sophie finally tired of swinging and demanded ice cream, they walked to the vendor cart near the pond. Ryan insisted on paying this time, despite Isabella's protests counting out exact change for 3 ice cream bars, with the careful attention of someone who knew the value of every dollar. As they sat on a bench eating their ice cream, Sophie between them with chocolate dripping down her chin, Isabella felt something she hadn't experienced since Sophie was born. Contentment. Not the careful satisfaction of a successful business deal or the polite pleasure of social obligations, but the deep, warm contentment of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right people. "Ryan," she said, as Sophie ran off to chase ducks by the pond. "I need you to understand something." He turned to look at her, his expression attentive and slightly concerned. "Last night at dinner, Sophie said you were nice because you got down to her level to talk to her, but that's not the only reason she likes you." "What do you mean?" Isabella watched her daughter bend down to examine something fascinating in the grass. Sophie has never had a father figure in her life. Her biological father left before she was born, and every man I've dated since then has seen her as an obstacle to overcome rather than a person to appreciate. Ryan was quiet, listening with the same focused attention he'd given to Sophie's stories the night before. "Sophie doesn't remember life without me, but she knows something's missing. She sees her friends with their fathers and asks me why she doesn't have one. I've always told her that our family is complete with just the 2 of us, that we don't need anyone else to be happy. But watching her with you yesterday, seeing how naturally you interact with her, I realized I might have been wrong about that." Isabella's voice grew softer. "I wasn't looking for a father for Sophie when I agreed to meet you. I was curious about the man Derek had chosen to humiliate, and I wanted to turn his cruel plan against him. But watching you 2 together, seeing how happy you make her just by treating her like she matters," she paused, gathering her courage for what she wanted to say next. "I think Sophie's been waiting for someone like you without even knowing it. And honestly, so have I." Ryan felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Isabella, I need you to know that I don't see Sophie as something to tolerate or work around. She's remarkable. She's funny and smart and honest in ways that most adults have forgotten how to be. Spending time with both of you yesterday was the best evening I've had in years." He watched Sophie squat down to examine a particularly interesting leaf, her small face scrunched in concentration. "I lost my wife 18 months ago. She left because she said I wasn't enough, that I couldn't give her the life she deserved. For 1.5 years, I believed that. I thought maybe I was just meant to be alone, that someone like me didn't deserve a family. But watching Sophie yesterday, listening to her laugh, having her trust me enough to hold my hand and share her stories, it reminded me that maybe I do have something to offer. Maybe being enough isn't about money or status. Maybe it's about showing up, being present, caring about the people in your life." Isabella reached over and took his hand. "Ryan Thompson, you are more than enough. You're exactly what Sophie and I have been missing without knowing it." Sophie chose that moment to run back to them. Her cheeks flushed with excitement and her hands cupped around something precious. "Look what I found," she announced, opening her palms to reveal a smooth, heart-shaped stone. "It's a treasure, and I found it while you 2 were talking about important things." She looked between them with the knowing expression that children sometimes wore when they understood more than adults gave them credit for. "Are you going to be my friend forever, Ryan?" she asked with the directness that only 3-year-olds could manage. If that's what you want, Ryan said seriously, I'd like that very much. It is what I want, Sophie declared. And Mummy wants it too. She gets happy eyes when she talks about you. Isabella laughed, embarrassed but pleased by her daughter's observation. Happy eyes, very happy eyes, Sophie confirmed. Like when you look at me, but different. More like when you look at chocolate cake. Both adults burst into laughter at Sophie's comparison, and the little girl beamed with pride at making them happy. As the afternoon wore on, they walked around the park, Sophie running ahead to investigate every interesting tree, flower, and squirrel, while Ryan and Isabella talked about everything and nothing. The conversation flowed with the same easy naturalness they'd discovered the night before, but now it was deepened by honesty and the recognition of genuine connection. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, they found themselves back at the bench where they'd eaten ice cream hours earlier. Sophie had finally worn herself out and was curled up between them, her head on Isabella's lap and her legs across Ryan's knees, fast asleep, despite the outdoor setting. She trusts you completely, Isabella said softly, smoothing Sophie's hair. She's never fallen asleep like this around anyone except me. Ryan looked down at Sophie's peaceful face, her small hand still clutching the heart-shaped stone she'd found. I can't remember the last time I felt this. Content, he said quietly, like everything in the world was exactly as it should be. Isabella studied his profile in the golden evening light. This man who had been chosen as a target for cruelty had instead become the answer to prayers she hadn't known she was praying. Monday morning would bring the real world back to them. Derek Matthews would face the consequences of his actions. Isabella would return to her responsibilities at Hart Industries, and Ryan would go back to Morrison's auto repair. But for now, in this moment, they were exactly where they belonged. Monday morning arrived like a storm front, and Derek Matthews was about to discover that some lessons came with a very high price. Derek's alarm clock had been ringing for 5 minutes before he finally rolled over and turned it off. His head was pounding from too much wine and too little sleep, and his mouth tasted like regret mixed with expensive alcohol. He'd spent most of Sunday fielding phone calls from increasingly nervous business associates, all of them asking careful questions about his judgment and professional discretion. By evening, the pattern had become clear. William Hart was asking questions, and when William Hart asked questions about someone's character, smart people paid attention. Derek forced himself out of bed and into the shower, trying to wash away the growing certainty that Friday night's entertainment was going to cost him more than the dinner bill. As the hot water pounded against his back, he tried to figure out how to explain to his boss that a practical joke had somehow turned into a professional nightmare. The commute to Kensington Financial took Derek through the heart of downtown, past glass towers that housed the city's most powerful companies. Hart Industries occupied an entire building near the financial district, its logo visible from Derek's office window, as a daily reminder of the kind of success that demanded respect. Derek had always been proud of his corner office, his expensive suits, his reputation as someone who got things done without worrying too much about whose feelings got hurt in the process. Today, those things felt fragile, as if they could disappear with a phone call from the wrong person. At exactly 9 o'clock, Derek's assistant knocked on his office door with the kind of expression that suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Matthews, Mr. Kensington would like to see you in his office immediately." Richard Kensington was the founder and CEO of Kensington Financial, a man who had built his investment firm from nothing and had very strong opinions about what kind of behavior reflected well on his company. He was also Derek, suddenly remembered with growing alarm, a long-time golf partner of William Hart. Derek straightened his tie and walked down the hallway to the executive suite, his footsteps echoing on marble floors that suddenly seemed less impressive and more ominous. Kensington's office was a study in understated power. Rich wood paneling, leather-bound books, awards, and photographs documenting 30 years of financial success. Kensington himself sat behind a desk that could have been an aircraft carrier, his expression unreadable but definitely not friendly. "Sit down," Derek Kensington said without preamble. "We need to talk." Derek sat trying to project confidence, while his stomach churned with anxiety. "I had an interesting conversation this morning with William Hart," Kensington continued. "He was asking about your character, your judgment, your fitness to represent this company in professional settings." The words hit Derek like physical blows. William Hart had been asking questions about him personally. This wasn't just about business relationships or investment deals. This was about his reputation, his career, his future. "He seemed particularly interested in your activities last Friday evening," Kensington went on. "Something about a restaurant, a practical joke, an attempt to humiliate someone for entertainment purposes." Derek opened his mouth to defend himself, to explain that it had just been harmless fun, that no one had actually been hurt. But the words died in his throat when he saw the expression on Kensington's face. "Derek, in the 30 years I've been running this company, I've learned that character matters more than credentials. Our clients trust us with their money, their futures, their legacies. They need to believe that the people representing Kensington Financial are individuals of integrity and sound judgment." Kensington stood up and walked to the window overlooking the financial district. "In all that time, I've never had William Hart call me to express concerns about one of my employees' personal conduct. William Hart is one of the most respected businessmen in this city. When he questions someone's character, people listen." The older man turned back to face Derek, his expression grave. "Effective immediately. You're on administrative leave pending a full review of your conduct and your fitness to continue representing this company. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings." Derek felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Administrative leave was corporate speak for career suicide. Once word got out that Kensington Financial had suspended him pending a character review, no other investment firm in the city would touch him. "Mr. Kensington, I can explain. It was just a joke. Nobody actually got hurt." "Derek, the problem isn't what you did. The problem is that you thought it was appropriate to do it. That tells me everything I need to know about your judgment and your character." Kensington pressed a button on his phone. "Security, please escort Mr. Matthews to his office, and then off the premises." As Derek was walked through the office by 2 security guards past colleagues who suddenly became very interested in their computer screens, he finally understood what Isabella had meant when she'd talked about influence and phone calls. Derek Matthews had learned that some entertainment was too expensive to afford. Meanwhile, across town at Morrison's Auto Repair, Ryan was discovering that his life was about to change in ways he'd never imagined. He was underneath a Honda Civic wrestling with a stubborn oil filter when he heard the shop's bell chime, indicating someone had entered. Ryan called out from under the car, his voice slightly muffled by the engine above him. "Be right with you. Just finishing up here." "Take your time," a voice replied. "I'm in no hurry." There was something familiar about the voice, but Ryan couldn't place it until he rolled out from under the Honda and found himself looking up at a man in an expensive suit who somehow managed to make even the garage setting look comfortable rather than out of place. William Hart stood in the middle of Morrison's Auto Repair like he belonged there, his hands clasped behind his back as he examined the neat organization of tools, the clean work areas, the pride that showed in every detail of Ryan's shop. "Mr. Hart," Ryan said quickly, wiping his hands on a rag and standing up. "This is unexpected. Is there something wrong with your car?" William smiled, and Ryan saw where Isabella had gotten her warmth. "Not with my car, no. I wanted to meet the man who made such an impression on my daughter and granddaughter this weekend." Ryan felt heat rise in his cheeks. "They're remarkable people, sir. I enjoyed spending time with them very much. So I understand." William walked slowly around the garage, his experienced eyes taking in the quality of Ryan's work, the respect he showed for his tools, the obvious care he took with his customers' property. Isabella told me about Derek Matthews' little plan to humiliate you. She also told me how you handled yourself throughout the evening. Ryan wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he remained quiet, letting William Hart set the pace of the conversation. Do you know anything about my background, Ryan? Not much beyond the fact that you built Hart Industries into something impressive. William stopped next to Uncle Pete's old workbench, running his fingers along the worn wooden surface. My father was a maintenance supervisor in a downtown office building. Every day after school, I'd go to work with him, learning how buildings worked from the foundation up. I learned the value of honest work and fair treatment from a man who never made more than $30,000 in a single year. He turned to look directly at Ryan. But I also learned that success isn't measured by what you make, it's measured by what you build, and how you treat people while you're building it. Ryan found himself thinking of Uncle Pete, who had taught him similar lessons in this very garage. Isabella told me you took over this business when your uncle passed away, William continued. That you kept all his employees, even though downsizing would have been more profitable. That you've built a reputation for honest work and fair prices. That's what Uncle Pete taught me, Ryan said simply. He always said that your reputation is the only thing you really own. Smart man. William walked over to look at the framed photo of Uncle Pete standing next to the restored Mustang. Isabella also told me that you treat my granddaughter like she matters, not like an inconvenience to be managed while you pursue her mother. Sophie's an amazing little girl, Ryan said. Any man who sees her as anything other than a blessing doesn't deserve to be in Isabella's life. William nodded approvingly. That's exactly what I wanted to hear. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, handing it to Ryan. Hart Industries has a fleet of vehicles that need regular maintenance. Trucks, company cars, construction equipment. We currently contract that work out to 3 different shops, none of which provide the kind of personal service that builds long-term relationships. Ryan looked at the business card, then back at William Hart. I'm flattered, sir, but I'm not sure my shop is big enough to handle that kind of contract. Then maybe it's time to expand, William said with a slight smile. I didn't build Hart Industries by playing it safe, Ryan. I built it by recognizing opportunity and having the courage to take calculated risks. He gestured around the garage. You have the foundation here. Good reputation, quality work, honest dealings. What you need is capital to grow, to hire good people, to expand your capacity. William Hart was offering him the opportunity of a lifetime, and Ryan felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Why, he asked honestly. Why would you take that kind of risk on someone you just met? Because my daughter and granddaughter are excellent judges of character, William replied. Because Derek Matthews chose you as a target for humiliation, which tells me you're exactly the kind of person worth knowing. And because 35 years ago, someone took a chance on a maintenance worker's son who had big dreams and no money. Ryan stared at the business card in his hands. Hart Industries logo printed in elegant lettering, a phone number that could change everything. I don't know what to say, he admitted. Say you'll think about it, William suggested. Say you'll let me know by Friday whether you're interested in a partnership that could benefit both of us. A partnership Hart Industries provides the capital for expansion. You provide the expertise and management. We split the profits according to a formula that recognizes both contributions. William extended his hand to Ryan. Think it over. Talk to Isabella about it. But remember that opportunities like this don't come along very often. As they shook hands, Ryan felt like his entire world was shifting beneath his feet. 3 days ago, he'd been a struggling mechanic, barely making ends meet. Now he was being offered a partnership with one of the city's most successful companies. Mr. Hart, Ryan said, as William prepared to leave. Thank you for believing in me, for giving me this chance, for raising an incredible daughter and granddaughter. William smiled. Thank you for reminding me that character still matters more than credentials. Isabella and Sophie deserve someone who sees them for who they are, not what they represent. That evening, Ryan called Isabella with news that left both of them amazed and slightly overwhelmed by how quickly their lives were changing. He offered you a partnership. Isabella's voice carried wonder and excitement. Ryan, do you understand what this means? I think so, Ryan said, though he was still trying to process the day's events. Your father is offering me the chance to build something bigger than I ever imagined possible. He's offering you the chance to become the man you've always been capable of being. Isabella corrected gently. My father sees potential that others miss. That's how he built his empire, by recognizing value where others see only surface appearances. Do you think I should take it? Isabella was quiet for a moment, and Ryan could almost hear her thinking through the implications. I think you should do what feels right to you, she said finally. But I also think my father doesn't make offers like this lightly. If he believes in you, maybe it's time you started believing in yourself. That night, Ryan lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about Uncle Pete and the lessons he'd learned in this garage. About Sarah's letter and the pain of being told he wasn't enough. About Isabella and Sophie and the possibility of a family he'd never dared to hope for. About William Hart's offer and the chance to build something that would honor Uncle Pete's memory while creating a legacy for the future. By morning, he'd made his decision. 6 months later, Thompson Hart Automotive occupied a building 3 times the size of the original Morrison's shop, with 8 experienced mechanics, state-of-the-art equipment, and a waiting list of customers who had heard about their reputation for quality work and honest dealing. Ryan stood in his office looking out at the bustling garage floor where men and women he'd hired worked with the same pride and attention to detail that Uncle Pete had taught him. On his desk sat a framed photo of the original Morrison's shop. Uncle Pete's gentle smile, a daily reminder of the values that had built this success. The phone on his desk rang, and Isabella's voice filled the room with warmth. Are you ready for tonight? She asked. As ready as a man can be for the most important question of his life, Ryan replied. Sophie's been practicing her job as ring bearer all morning. Isabella laughed. She's very serious about her responsibilities. Tonight, Ryan would ask Isabella to marry him. The ring was already in his pocket, a simple but elegant diamond that he'd chosen with Sophie's help 3 weeks ago. They'd spent an hour at the jewelry store while Sophie examined every ring with the focused attention of a professional consultant. That one she'd finally announced, pointing to the ring that had immediately caught Ryan's eye as well. It's perfect for Mummy because it's beautiful, but not too fancy. She doesn't like fancy things that much. The saleswoman had smiled at Sophie's confident assessment, and Ryan had known immediately that his 3-year-old consultant was absolutely right. The proposal would take place at Riverside Park at the same bench where they'd eaten ice cream on their first afternoon together. Isabella thought they were going for an ordinary Sunday picnic, but Ryan had spent weeks planning every detail. Sophie was in charge of bringing the heart-shaped stone she'd found that first day, which she'd been carrying in her pocket like a talisman ever since. William Hart would be hiding behind a tree with a camera ready to capture the moment when his daughter realized what was happening. The past 6 months had transformed all their lives in ways none of them could have anticipated. Thompson Hart Automotive was thriving beyond Ryan's wildest dreams. Isabella had taken on a more active role at Hart Industries, working closely with her father to ensure their partnership with Ryan's company continued to benefit both businesses. Most importantly, they'd become a family in all but legal terms. Ryan spent most evenings at Isabella's house, helping Sophie with her bedtime routine, reading stories and marveling at how naturally he'd slipped into the role of father figure that Sophie had been waiting for her entire short life. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Learning to merge their different worlds, their different backgrounds, their different expectations had required patience and compromise from everyone involved. But love, Ryan had discovered, made those challenges feel like adventures rather than obstacles. Derek Matthews, meanwhile, had learned that actions had consequences. His suspension from Kensington Financial had become permanent termination when the character review revealed a pattern of questionable judgment and unprofessional behavior. No other investment firm in the city would hire him, and he'd eventually been forced to leave town and start over somewhere his reputation couldn't follow him. Trevor and Austin had faced their own professional consequences as word of their Friday evening entertainment spread through their social circles. It turned out that cruelty, even when disguised as humor, wasn't as amusing to others as they'd believed. But Derek's failure had become Ryan's opportunity, and sometimes justice worked in unexpected ways. As Sunday afternoon arrived, Ryan drove to Isabella's house with his heart hammering and the ring box making his pocket feel impossibly heavy. Sophie met him at the door, practically bouncing with excitement about their picnic plans. She had no idea she was about to help orchestrate the most important moment of all their lives. At the park, as they spread their picnic blanket on the grass near the pond, Ryan watched Isabella laugh at something Sophie said, and felt his chest tighten with overwhelming love. This woman, this child, this life they'd built together, it was everything he'd never known he wanted, and more than he'd ever believed he deserved. When the moment came when Sophie handed him the heart-shaped stone with a solemn expression, and Isabella looked at him with sudden understanding, Ryan dropped to one knee and asked the question that would determine their future. "Isabella Hart, will you marry me?" Through her tears, through Sophie's excited squealing, through the sound of William Hart's camera clicking from his hiding place behind the oak tree, Isabella's answer rang clear and certain. Yes, Ryan Thompson, yes, yes, yes. They were married 3 months later in the same park where they'd shared their first afternoon together, where they'd fallen in love gradually, and then all at once, where they'd learned that family wasn't about where you came from, but about who you chose to love. Sophie served as flower girl and ring bearer, taking both jobs seriously and executing them with the focused determination she brought to everything important in her life. William Hart walked his daughter down the aisle, his eyes bright with tears, and his heart full of gratitude for the man who had brought such joy to his family. Uncle Pete's photo sat in a place of honor at the reception, watching over the celebration of love that had grown from the foundation he'd helped Ryan build. As Ryan and Isabella danced their first dance as husband and wife, with Sophie standing beside them, holding both their hands, they reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them together. Derek Matthews had meant to prove that some people should know their place, that social boundaries were walls that couldn't be crossed. Instead, he'd demonstrated that real love transcended artificial barriers, that character mattered more than credentials, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories grew from the most unlikely beginnings. Thompson Hart Automotive continued to thrive, employing dozens of people and serving hundreds of customers who valued honest work and fair treatment. Isabella took on greater responsibilities at Hart Industries, while Ryan built his business with the same values Uncle Pete had taught him. Most importantly, Sophie Thompson now had the father she'd been waiting for her entire life, a man who saw her not as an obligation or an obstacle, but as the remarkable little person she'd always been. Some stories end with justice. Others end with love. The best ones, like this one, end with both. Friends, if this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, if it reminded you that kindness still matters and that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, please don't just listen and forget. Hit that like button to show your support for stories that restore faith in humanity. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales that prove good people still exist in this world. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that our worst moments don't define us, but how we choose to treat others always does. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time when someone's kindness changed your life, or when you had the chance to show kindness to a stranger. Your stories matter, and you never know whose day you might brighten by sharing them. Remember, real wealth isn't measured in bank accounts. It's measured in the lives we touch, the love we share, and the character we build one choice at a time. Thanks for being part of our community, where every story matters and every heart has value. Until next time, keep believing in the power of unexpected kindness and second chance.